An entire world died in a single night. Not from a war, not from a bomb. Every living thing on it, gone in an instant, drained down to nothing, by a ritual so dark that even the Sith who performed it never spoke of it again. Thousands of Sith lords walked onto that planet believing they were about to save their empire. None of them walked off. One being did. He didn't just survive the ritual. He became something else entirely. Something that would go on to rule from the shadows for over 1,000 years. That ritual has a name. So does the man who performed it. And so does almost everything else you're about to hear. Because that world wasn't the only secret the Sith buried. Somewhere out there, right now, a tomb is sealed shut around a spirit that has been waiting centuries for someone to walk in and ask it the wrong question. Ask that question, and the tomb doesn't just answer you. It changes you. Some who entered came out with power no living master could teach them. Most never came out at all. This is not the story of lightsabers or armies, or the famous betrayals every fan already knows by heart. This is the knowledge the Sith kept from each other. Rituals so costly, masters would rather take them to the grave than teach them to their own apprentices. Doctrines so unstable that even beings who believed weakness itself deserved to be destroyed still chose, again and again, to bury what they had discovered rather than let it spread. Ask yourself this: what kind of secret is dangerous enough that the most ruthless beings in the galaxy are the ones burying it? That question is where we begin. Settle in. What follows is a slow descent into the archives. The galaxy was never meant to read. The rituals so forbidden that even the Sith who mastered them chose, in the end, to make sure no one ever mastered them again. There is a particular kind of silence that surrounds this category of knowledge. Different from the silence of things simply forgotten. Forgotten knowledge disappears by accident, lost to fires, to conquest, to the slow indifference of time erasing records nobody thought to preserve. Forbidden knowledge disappears on purpose. Someone, at some point, made a deliberate choice to bury it rather than let it spread. And that choice tells us something the knowledge itself never could. It tells us where the line sat for people who otherwise recognized almost no lines at all. Conquerors who slaughtered without hesitation, who tortured without remorse, who believed weakness itself was a kind of moral failing deserving of destruction. When beings like that decide something is too dangerous to teach, too costly to practice, too corrosive even to their own uses of the dark side, that decision carries a weight no outside observer's warning ever could. It means the practitioners themselves, the ones with the least reason in the galaxy to fear power, looked at what they had built and flinched. That flinch is what this video is really about, not the rituals themselves, fascinating as they are, but the moments when even the most ruthless dark side masters in galactic history recognized a threshold they were not willing to cross twice. Some crossed it once and spent the rest of their existence trying to contain what they had unleashed. Others sensed the threshold approaching and turned away before ever reaching it, choosing instead to bury the theoretical knowledge deep enough that no successor could stumble onto it by accident. Either way, what survives today exists only in fragments, second-hand accounts, artifacts recovered from sealed vaults, testimony extracted from practitioners who had every reason to lie about what they had seen and done. Piecing together a coherent picture from wreckage like that is slow, uncertain work, and everything that follows should be understood in that spirit. Less a definitive record than a reconstruction built from shadows, rumor, and the occasional unlucky witness who lived long enough to describe what they had found. To understand why some Sith knowledge became forbidden even to the Sith, you first have to understand what the Sith were rebelling against. Long before there was an empire of red suns and black temples, there was only the Jedi Order. And within that order, a growing argument about what the Force was actually for. The mainstream teaching held that the Force was to be approached with patience, serenity, and detachment. That emotion was a doorway to danger, and control was the highest virtue a Force user could achieve. A minority disagreed. They believed the Jedi were starving themselves of half their birthright, that passion and ambition were not corruptions of the Force, but expressions of it, and that a philosophy built entirely around restraint would always be weaker than one that embraced the full range of what a living being could feel. This disagreement simmered for generations before it finally boiled over into open conflict. A war fought not just with blades, but with ideas. Each side certain the other was leading itself toward ruin. When the dust settled, the losers of that war were not executed. They were shown a kind of mercy that would prove far more dangerous than a blade. They were stripped of their weapons, loaded onto unarmed ships, and cast out into the unknown regions of space. Exiled from the civilization that had raised them, left to wander the dark, with nothing but their anger and their forbidden philosophy intact. Exile should have killed them. Instead, it freed them. Somewhere in that void, drifting without a destination, these outcasts stumbled onto a world that would rewrite the future of the galaxy. It was a harsh red world, scarred by ancient wars of its own, home to a native species that had a raw, untutored connection to the dark side of the Force, though they understood it only as sorcery, only as the old and terrible magic of their ancestors. The exiles, trained Force users with centuries of theory behind them, looked at this primitive relationship with dark power and saw not competition but opportunity. They presented themselves as divine beings, as living gods descended to rule over the natives. And the natives, awed and terrified by displays of power they had no framework to explain, worshipped them without question. Over time, the exiles did more than rule. They intermarried, they absorbed the native bloodlines, they blended their disciplined but forbidden Jedi training with a raw, untamed, dark side sorcery that had never been diluted by centuries of caution. The result was something new, something that had never existed before. It was no longer Jedi philosophy taken to an extreme. It was its own tradition, with its own name, its own hierarchy, and its own hunger for secrets the Jedi Order would never have permitted its members to touch. It is easy, looking back with the benefit of hindsight, to imagine that this transformation happened quickly, that a handful of exiled Jedi arrived on a hostile world and simply declared themselves the founders of a new dark tradition within a single generation. The truth was slower and stranger than that. The first years of exile were not spent building temples or codifying doctrine. They were spent surviving, learning to read a landscape that offered no mercy to newcomers, learning the customs of a native population that had every reason to distrust pale-skinned strangers who fell out of the sky claiming divinity. The earliest interactions were tentative, watchful, each side testing how far the other could be pushed before violence became inevitable. It was only after the exiles proved, again and again, that their command of the Force could accomplish things the natives' own sorcerers could never replicate. Healing wounds that should have been fatal, calling storms down on rival settlements, reading intentions before they were spoken aloud, the genuine reverence began to take root. Worship is not built on a single miracle. It is built on a pattern of miracles repeated often enough that doubt no longer feels like a reasonable position to hold. And the exiles understood, whether through calculation or simple necessity, that consistency was the price of the power they were being offered. What made this new relationship so combustible, in hindsight, was that both sides were bringing something the other lacked. The exiles carried centuries of disciplined force theory, an understanding of technique, of meditation, of the deliberate structuring of will that the native sorcerers, gifted as they naturally were, had never had the luxury of developing in isolation. The natives, in turn, possessed something the exiles' own tradition had spent generations trying to suppress: an unfiltered, almost feral relationship with the darker currents of the Force, untouched by centuries of Jedi doctrine insisting that such currents were dangerous and best left unexplored. When these two traditions merged, neither remained what it had been. The exiles' discipline gave the native sorcery structure and repeatability, turning what had been closer to folk magic into something that could be taught, refined, and passed down with intention. The native sorcery, in turn, gave the exiles' discipline a ferocity and a willingness to cross lines their old order would never have sanctioned. Each side lost a piece of its original identity in the exchange. And what emerged from that loss was something neither could have created alone. The earliest rulers to emerge from this fusion faced a problem their exiled predecessors had never needed to solve. The old Jedi Order, whatever its disagreements, had a shared institutional structure, a council, a temple, a tradition of record-keeping that ensured knowledge, once discovered, tended to persist and spread through the Order as a whole. The new dark side rulers had no such structure, and worse, they had every reason not to want one. A council implies shared authority, and shared authority was precisely the arrangement these rulers had rejected when they broke from the Jedi in the first place. What they built instead was something closer to a pyramid of individual fiefdoms, each ruler answering nominally to whoever held the greatest overall power, but each also guarding their own personal discoveries as jealously as any conquered territory. This structural choice, made in the earliest days of the tradition, almost by default, rather than deliberate design, ended up shaping the fate of forbidden knowledge for every generation that followed. Where the Jedi tended to lose knowledge through neglect, through archives that simply grew too vast to maintain, the new dark side order lost knowledge through violence, through the simple and recurring fact that a ruler who died without naming a trusted heir to their secrets took those secrets with them into whatever tomb their successors eventually built to house their remains. The Jedi, whatever their flaws, had a council, a code, a slow and deliberate culture of review that filtered dangerous ideas before they spread. The new dark side order had none of that. It had ambition. It had isolation from any outside authority that might have said no. And it had access to native traditions of sorcery that no outsider had ever studied or catalogued. Early rulers of this new order didn't ask whether a technique was wise. They asked whether it worked. And if it worked, they asked whether it could be made to work better. And if it could be made to work better, they asked what the true limit of that power might be. This became the seed of an entire culture of experimentation, one where each generation of dark side masters pushed slightly further than the last, testing the outer edges of what the Force would permit a mortal being to do, and slowly, deliberately, learning to bury the results that proved too costly, too unstable, or too revealing of the practitioner's own weaknesses to share even with their most trusted apprentices. It is worth pausing here to understand why a Sith Lord, of all people, would choose to hide knowledge rather than use it to dominate a rival. The answer lies in the peculiar psychology of dark side power itself. Sith society was built on the belief that only the strong deserve to rule, that weakness should be culled rather than protected, and that an apprentice existed, in part, to be surpassed and eventually replaced. In a culture like that, knowledge is currency, and currency you hand to a subordinate is currency that subordinate can eventually use against you. A master who taught an apprentice every secret they knew was a master who had built their own executioner. So the deepest rituals, the ones capable of granting real and lasting power, rather than mere battlefield advantage, tended to be hoarded rather than spread. They were written in code, buried in locked vaults, entombed alongside their creators, or deliberately left half-finished, so that only the original practitioner understood how to complete them safely. What survived to be rediscovered centuries later was often only a fragment, a rumor, a warning scrawled in the margins of some crumbling text, enough to tantalize a future seeker without ever fully explaining how to replicate what had been done. This hoarding instinct hardened over the centuries into something close to a formal tradition of its own. An unwritten code sitting alongside the more familiar Sith principles of strength and conquest. Masters learned to teach in layers, offering an apprentice only the portion of a technique needed to be useful in the present moment, always withholding the final step, the missing ingredient, the specific phrase or gesture that turned a partial ritual into a complete one. This layered secrecy served two purposes at once. It protected the master from betrayal, since an apprentice who knew only pieces of a dangerous ritual could not easily use it against the very person who had taught them, and it ensured that the master remained perpetually necessary, that no apprentice, however talented, could ever fully replace their teacher without first surviving long enough and proving themselves loyal enough to be trusted with the last unspoken piece of the puzzle. Some scholars of this era have suggested that this culture of deliberate incompleteness explains why so many powerful Sith traditions simply vanished rather than spreading and multiplying the way one might expect genuinely useful knowledge to spread. A technique fragmented across a chain of masters and apprentices, each holding back some crucial detail from the next, was a technique perpetually one assassination away from being lost entirely. And assassination, in Sith society, was rarely in short supply. Among the earliest and most feared of these buried traditions was the practice the galaxy would come to call Sith alchemy, a discipline that treated flesh, bone, and metal as raw material to be reshaped by will and dark side power rather than fixed and immutable substances. Where ordinary science worked through careful, incremental experimentation, alchemy worked through something closer to forced transformation, bending the natural properties of a living or non-living thing until it became something its original nature never intended. Alchemists learned to twist the growth of creatures into monstrous new forms, breeding and warping beasts until they became living weapons, loyal only to the will of their creator, immune to fear, immune to mercy, driven by an artificially implanted hunger for violence that made them devastating on any battlefield. Entire species were said to have been reshaped this way, their original forms lost to history, replaced by something larger, crueler, and far more obedient than nature would ever have produced on its own. These creatures were not raised. They were made, assembled from the dark side outward, their minds simplified and their instincts sharpened until nothing remained of whatever gentler animal they had once been. Some alchemists specialized almost exclusively in this beastcraft, building reputations that rivaled any battlefield commander despite never personally raising a lightsaber in anger. Their creations were prized not merely for their ferocity but for their obedience, a quality far harder to engineer than raw aggression. A monster that attacked indiscriminately was a liability as often as an asset, as likely to turn on its own creator in the chaos of battle as on the intended enemy. True mastery of the discipline lay in binding a creature's loyalty as thoroughly as its body had been reshaped, weaving obedience directly into the creature's altered nervous system so that it responded to a single voice, a single presence, sometimes a single scent above all others. Warlords who commanded these engineered beasts guarded their alchemists as jealously as they guarded any weapon vault, understanding that the true value lay not in any single creature, but in the practitioner's ability to produce more of them on demand. Losing an alchemist to assassination or old age could set a bloodline's military strength back by a generation, since apprentices who had merely observed the process rarely possessed the instinctive feel for the ritual's more delicate variables, the precise timing, the exact resonance of a chant that separated a stable transformation from a writhing, uncontrollable failure. The alchemical tradition also produced stranger, quieter creations that never saw a battlefield at all. Servants engineered for infiltration rather than violence, their altered forms allowing them to pass unnoticed through populations that would have recognized an obvious monster on sight. Some were said to retain enough of their original intelligence to hold conversations, to gather information, to report back to their masters in fluent, unremarkable speech, their monstrous nature hidden entirely beneath an ordinary appearance until the moment their true purpose was required. These creations were, if anything, considered more dangerous than the beasts bred purely for combat, because their existence proved that alchemy's reach extended into the realm of deception as thoroughly as it extended into the realm of raw physical power, and because a spy who did not know it had once been something else entirely, was a spy whose loyalty could never quite be verified by any conventional means. The same alchemical principles were applied to metal and mineral as readily as to flesh. Practitioners learned to infuse ore with dark side energy during the forging process, binding malevolent intent directly into the molecular structure of a blade or a suit of armor, so that the weapon itself seemed to carry a portion of its creator's will long after that creator had died. Warriors who wielded these alchemically treated weapons reported that the blades seemed to want to be used, that they resisted being sheathed, that they grew warm in moments of anger, as though hungry for the fight to come. Armor forged this way was said to protect its wearer, not merely through physical density, but through a kind of psychic aggression, projecting fear into the minds of anyone who looked at it, a deterrent as much as a shield. Some of the rarest alloys produced through these techniques proved resistant even to a lightsaber's blade, a property so valuable that entire wars were fought over deposits of the raw ore needed to produce it, with the alchemical process itself remaining a closely guarded secret, passed down through only the most trusted bloodlines. But alchemy's most disturbing applications were reserved for living force users themselves. Masters of the discipline discovered that the same techniques used to warp a beast's body could, with far greater difficulty and far greater risk, be turned inward, altering a practitioner's own physiology to grant enhanced strength, extended life, or heightened resistance to injury. The temptation to attempt this kind of self-alteration proved almost impossible for ambitious Sith to resist, and the historical record, fragmentary as it is, suggests that far more attempted it than succeeded. Failed self-alchemy left its victims disfigured, their bodies, rebelling against unnatural changes, imposed on them faster than living tissue was ever meant to adapt. Skin calcified into brittle, cracked plating. Muscle tissue grew in patterns that no longer resembled anything biological. Minds, forced to process pain and transformation simultaneously through the dark side, rather than through the body's ordinary limits, sometimes simply broke, leaving behind a creature that retained flashes of its former intelligence, but had lost the ability to communicate, to plan, or to recognize former allies. These failed experiments were rarely killed outright. More often, they were locked away, hidden in the depths of the very fortresses their masters had built. An embarrassing reminder of ambition's cost, kept just out of sight of visiting dignitaries and hopeful new apprentices. Visitors to certain Sith strongholds. In the rare accounts that survive from outsiders who were permitted entry and lived to describe what they saw, occasionally reported hearing sounds from sealed lower levels that no one would explain. Scraping, low moaning, the rhythmic impact of something heavy striking stone again and again through the night. Servants in these fortresses learned quickly never to ask what lived beneath them, and masters who were pressed on the subject tended to respond with a silence far more unsettling than any explanation could have been. It became, in a grim and unspoken way, part of the architecture of power itself, a reminder to every apprentice walking those halls that ambition pursued too quickly or attempted without sufficient preparation did not simply fail cleanly. It lingered, it suffered, and it waited in the dark as a permanent monument to the gap between what a Sith Lord wished to become and what their body was actually capable of enduring. Not every failure was so total, however, and it is in the partial successes that some of the most feared Sith Lords in history are believed to have originated. A practitioner who survived a self-alchemical transformation without losing their mind entirely, but who nonetheless emerged permanently, altered, scarred, elongated, their features pulled subtly away from anything recognizably natural. Often found that the very disfigurement which might have been considered a failure became, in Sith culture, a kind of credential. A body, visibly marked by dark side transformation, was a body that announced its owner's willingness to pay any price for power, and that announcement alone was often enough to secure loyalty from followers who valued raw commitment over conventional notions of success. In this way, the line between failure and achievement in the alchemical tradition was never as clean as outsiders might assume. What looked like a monstrous mistake from a distance could, up close and among those who understood the culture that produced it, read instead as a badge of terrible, deliberate sacrifice. It was this uncomfortable truth that alchemical mastery so often produced monsters instead of miracles that pushed the discipline towards secrecy even within Sith society itself. A master who had successfully enhanced their own body through alchemy had every reason to keep the precise method hidden, both to prevent a rival from replicating their advantage and to avoid revealing how many failed attempts had preceded their success. Apprentices were taught the broad theory of alchemy, the philosophical framework that flesh and metal were both subject to the will of a sufficiently powerful dark side practitioner. But the specific formulas, the exact rituals, the precise sequence of dark side invocations needed to stabilize a transformation rather than let it spiral into disfigurement. Those details were guarded more closely than any battle plan. Entire alchemical traditions are believed to have died with their originators taken to unmarked graves, rather than risk falling into the hands of a student who might one day turn that knowledge against the very master who had taught it to them. There is something almost tragic in this pattern. When viewed from a distance, generation after generation of brilliant, ambitious practitioners rediscovering fragments of techniques their predecessors had already mastered centuries earlier, forced to relearn through their own costly trial and error what someone else had already paid the same price to learn, and then buried out of fear. The dark side tradition, for all its emphasis on strength and self-reliance, was in this sense remarkably inefficient, endlessly repeating its own worst mistakes. Because the very culture of secrecy that protected individual practitioners from betrayal also ensured that hard-won knowledge rarely survived intact across more than a generation or two. Some later Sith Lords recognized this inefficiency and attempted to correct it, building hidden archives meant to outlast their own reigns, encoding their discoveries in forms only a sufficiently determined and worthy successor could ever hope to decipher. Whether this represented genuine wisdom or simply a more patient form of the same hoarding instinct, a gift wrapped in enough obstacles that it functioned as a test as much as an inheritance, is difficult to say with any certainty from this distance. If alchemy represented the Sith reshaping the world around them, the tomb trials represented something more intimate, a tradition built around reshaping the practitioner from the inside, on the ancient dark side homeworld. Deep beneath the surface, generations of powerful Sith Lords were entombed in elaborate stone structures designed to outlast empires, their bodies interred alongside their most prized possessions, their most dangerous secrets, and, according to countless surviving accounts, fragments of their consciousness deliberately left behind to guard what they had buried. These tombs became the site of a brutal educational tradition. Apprentices seeking to prove themselves, or masters seeking to test a student's readiness for greater responsibility, would send initiates alone into these ancient structures, armed with little more than a blade and whatever dark side strength they had managed to cultivate, and instruct them to survive whatever waited inside. What waited inside varied from tomb to tomb, but the pattern was remarkably consistent across accounts separated by centuries. Traps calibrated not merely to kill, but to test the specific weaknesses of whoever triggered them. Illusions drawn directly from an intruder's own fears and memories. Twisting beloved faces into monstrous shapes designed to break the intruder's resolve before a single blow was struck. And, most disturbing of all, echoes of the tomb's original occupant, spectral remnants of long-dead Sith Lords who retained enough will and enough dark side power to manipulate, tempt, or outright possess anyone foolish enough to linger too long in their presence. Initiates who entered these tombs did not always return the same person who had walked in. Some emerged with new and terrifying abilities, having absorbed fragments of knowledge whispered to them by whatever intelligence still lingered in the stone. Others emerged hollowed out, their own personalities subtly overwritten by whatever ancient will had reached into their minds during the ordeal. Walking husks who spoke with their own voice but pursued goals that were no longer entirely their own. And a great many simply never emerged at all, their fates unknown, their bodies presumably added to whatever collection of failed initiates already lay scattered through the tomb's lower chambers. The tombs themselves were rarely simple structures. Generations of successive rulers added to them, sealing new chambers, layering new traps atop the old, until the largest of these sites became less a single tomb than an accumulated labyrinth, representing centuries of dark side ingenuity stacked one era on top of another. An initiate descending into the deepest of these structures might pass through a chamber built to test physical endurance, only to emerge into one built centuries later to test psychological resilience, only to emerge into a third built more recently still, designed around whatever new form of dark side manipulation its architect had most recently perfected. This layering meant that no two trials were ever quite identical, that a technique which had proven fatal to countless intruders over hundreds of years might suddenly encounter a visitor with exactly the right combination of skill and stubbornness to survive it, only to be destroyed instead by a completely different hazard, one chamber further in. The unpredictability was, in its own way, the entire point. A trial that could be studied and mastered through repetition ceased to be a meaningful test of raw capability, and the architects of these tombs understood that the only reliable filter was one that could never be fully anticipated in advance. Accounts describing what intruders actually encountered inside these deeper chambers tend to share a common thread despite being separated by centuries and recorded by witnesses who never had any contact with one another. The tombs did not simply present physical danger, they presented conversation. Voices emerged from the stone itself, addressing intruders by name, offering knowledge in exchange for small compromises. A single step off the intended path, a moment of hesitation before striking down a spectral figure wearing the face of someone the intruder had once loved. These bargains were rarely straightforward traps in the simplest sense. They were tests of judgment as much as tests of nerve, designed to reveal whether an initiate possessed the discipline to recognize a bargain not worth making, or whether ambition and curiosity would override caution the moment sufficiently tempting knowledge was dangled in front of them. Initiates who accepted too many of these bargains rarely emerged from the tomb as themselves. They emerged carrying pieces of whatever ancient intelligence had made the offers, sometimes usefully, sometimes catastrophically, and in either case, permanently. These sites did not maintain themselves, and behind every tomb's legendary dangers stood a quieter, less discussed tradition of caretakers, sometimes living acolytes assigned to a lifetime of service, maintaining a specific tomb's traps and wards, sometimes constructs and automated guardians built to outlast any organic caretaker's lifespan entirely. These keepers occupied a strange position within the broader dark side hierarchy, respected for their proximity to such dangerous power, and simultaneously regarded with a kind of wary distance by ordinary Sith lords who understood just how easily prolonged exposure to a tomb's lingering spirits could erode a caretaker's own sense of self. Many caretakers according to the sparse records that describe them, eventually stopped being entirely their own person at all, gradually absorbing enough of the tomb's ambient influence that visitors could no longer say with confidence whether they were speaking to a living guardian or to another manifestation of whatever ancient will the tomb had been built to preserve. This slow erosion was, in its own way, simply the tomb tradition's broader lesson playing out over a longer timescale. Proof that even those who approached forbidden knowledge cautiously, gradually, and with every intention of remaining in control of the process, were rarely able to hold that line indefinitely. The purpose of this brutal tradition was, on its surface, straightforward. A society built on the belief that only the strong deserved to survive had every incentive to filter out apprentices who lacked the will, the cunning, or the raw power to endure extreme psychological pressure. But there was a deeper purpose as well, one rarely spoken aloud even among the Sith themselves. These tombs functioned as a kind of forbidden library, a way of preserving dangerous knowledge without ever having to write it down where a rival might steal it. A Sith Lord who feared betrayal from their own apprentices could ensure that their most valuable secrets survived their death, not by trusting a successor, but by binding those secrets to their own restless spirit, sealed inside a tomb that only the most capable future initiates would ever be permitted or able to enter. In this way, forbidden knowledge became almost literally undead, preserved not on datapads or in written scrolls, but in the lingering consciousness of the dead themselves, doled out only to those judged worthy or unlucky enough to earn an audience with the past. This tradition of binding knowledge to spirit rather than to text led, inevitably, toward one of the most feared and most forbidden doctrines the dark side ever produced, the practice of transferring a living consciousness out of a dying body and into a new one entirely. If a Sith Lord's spirit could linger for centuries inside the stone of a tomb, dark side theorists reasoned, then perhaps that same lingering consciousness could be directed somewhere more useful than an ancient wall. Perhaps it could be directed into another living body altogether, granting its original owner a second lifetime, a third, an unbroken chain of stolen years extending indefinitely into the future. The theoretical appeal of this idea was obvious. Death was the one enemy even the most powerful Sith Lord could never defeat through conquest alone. A doctrine that promised to sidestep death entirely was, unsurprisingly, one of the most sought-after and most jealously guarded secrets in the entire dark side tradition. The practice, in the rare instances where historical accounts describe it in any detail, was as violent and unstable as it sounds. A practitioner nearing the end of their natural life, or facing a fatal wound they had no other way to survive, would attempt to force their consciousness across the gap separating one body from another, typically targeting an apprentice, a captured prisoner, or in more desperate cases, whatever living creature happened to be nearby. The receiving body's own consciousness had to be suppressed or destroyed to make room for the intruding will. A process that amounted to a kind of murder, performed not with a blade, but through sheer dark side domination, one mind forcibly evicting another from its rightful home. When the transfer succeeded cleanly, the practitioner awoke in a new, younger body with their full memory and power intact, having purchased additional decades of life at the cost of another being's entire existence. When it failed, and it failed far more often than surviving accounts care to admit, the results were catastrophic for everyone involved. Two consciousnesses trapped in a single body, neither strong enough to fully overwrite the other, could produce a fractured, unstable being, tormented by competing memories and competing wills, sometimes for the remainder of what proved to be a mercifully short and agonized life. Other failures left the transferring consciousness scattered and lost entirely, unable to find purchase in anybody at all, drifting as little more than a whisper of dark side energy until it faded from existence altogether. The ultimate death the practitioner had been so desperate to avoid, because the risk of catastrophic failure was so high, and because a successful transfer required both immense dark side mastery and a willing or overpowered host body, this doctrine remained one of the rarest and most tightly restricted forms of forbidden knowledge across Sith history. Masters who achieved it guarded the precise ritual with an intensity that bordered on paranoia, understanding that any apprentice who learned the technique gained, in effect, the tools needed to steal their master's continued existence right out from under them. Some traditions held that the ritual required the consent, however coerced, of the host body's original consciousness. A psychological negotiation as much as a metaphysical one, meaning that a masterful practitioner needed not just raw power, but a genuine talent for domination and persuasion, for breaking a mind down until it agreed to surrender its own body without a physical fight ever taking place. This made the ritual as much a study in cruelty as in metaphysics, and later generations of Sith who studied the fragmentary records left behind often concluded that the true danger of the technique was never really the risk of failure. It was the fact that it worked at all, that it offered ambitious dark side users a genuine path around the one limit even the greatest conquerors had always been forced to respect. Preparations for a successful transfer, according to the handful of detailed accounts that survive, could stretch across years rather than days. A practitioner did not simply wait until death was imminent and then attempt the ritual in desperation. Though desperate, hastily improvised, attempts certainly happened and accounted for a disproportionate share of the recorded failures. The careful, deliberate practitioners instead began identifying and cultivating potential host bodies decades in advance, often selecting apprentices specifically for their physical compatibility rather than their raw force potential, raising and training a chosen host for years while concealing the true purpose behind the relationship. Some hosts were kept entirely ignorant of their intended fate, believing themselves genuinely valued students right up until the moment their master's consciousness came flooding into their mind and began the slow, violent work of eviction. Others were told plainly what awaited them and given a choice, though the nature of Sith power dynamics meant that such choices were rarely as free as they were presented to be. Refusal often carrying consequences severe enough to make submission look, by comparison, like the more survivable option. The moment of transfer itself, in the rare descriptions left behind by witnesses who observed one and lived to record it, was described less as a single event than as a struggle stretched across an agonizing span of time, sometimes minutes, sometimes, in cases where the host resisted with unusual strength of will, considerably longer. Observers spoke of the host body convulsing, its voice shifting unpredictably between its own natural register and tones that did not belong to it, its eyes flickering between expressions that seemed to belong to two entirely different people occupying the same face in rapid alternation. Successful transfers were said to end suddenly, the host body going still for a long, silent moment before opening its eyes with an entirely different bearing. an entirely different way of holding itself. The physical mannerisms of the original consciousness now animating unfamiliar flesh with an ease that unsettled even hardened witnesses. Unsuccessful transfers rarely ended so cleanly. Some stretched on for hours before finally collapsing into whatever fractured, doubled state the failure produced. Others ended abruptly and violently, the host body dying outright, as its nervous system simply failed under the strain of hosting a will it was never built to contain, taking the intruding consciousness down with it into whatever oblivion awaited a Sith spirit unable to find purchase anywhere else. Nowhere did the pursuit of that limit produce a more catastrophic result than in the single most infamous ritual in the entire history of the dark side, an act of sacrifice so vast that its scars remain visible across the galaxy to this day. Its architect was a Sith Lord who understood, earlier and more clearly than any of his contemporaries, that individual power would never be enough, that even the most successful essence transfer only bought a practitioner a handful of extra lifetimes before the accumulated strain finally caught up with them. What he wanted was not another lifetime. He wanted permanence. An unbreakable existence unbound from the frailty of any single body, and he had concluded, through years of study, that his fellow Sith dismissed as scholarly cowardice, while they marched off to war and died by the thousands, that the only way to achieve true immortality was to stop drawing power from a single life at a time and instead draw it from an entire world at once. He waited while his rivals destroyed themselves in a war he refused to join, watching from isolation as armies he could have commanded were ground into dust against a republic that ultimately crushed the Sith Empire of his era beyond recognition. When the war ended and the survivors scattered into hiding, broken, leaderless, and terrified of Jedi hunters combing the galaxy for any remaining trace of Sith bloodlines, he emerged from his isolation with an offer of salvation. He told the survivors that resistance alone would never save them, that only a single overwhelming display of dark side power could guarantee their safety, and that if they gathered together on his world, they could perform a ritual capable of shielding them from their enemies forever. Thousands answered his call, arriving in good faith, believing they were about to strike back against the forces that had shattered their empire. What they found instead was a trap disguised as a sanctuary. The preparation for that gathering had, by every surviving account, taken years rather than months. A patient campaign of reassurance and hospitality designed to lower the guard of beings who had survived precisely because they trusted no one. Word was sent quietly through networks of loyal agents scattered across dozens of worlds, each message carefully tailored to the specific fears and specific pride of whichever fractured remnant it was meant to reach. Some were told that a great weapon had been recovered and needed only their combined strength to activate it against the encroaching Republic fleets. Others were told simply that safety existed nowhere else, that every other refuge had already been discovered and purged, and that this single gathering represented the last surviving sanctuary in a galaxy that had turned entirely against them. Ships arrived from every direction over a span of many months, their occupants exhausted, frightened, and, for the first time in years, allowed to believe that the worst might finally be behind them. They were greeted not with suspicion but with genuine seeming warmth, housed in comfortable quarters, fed well, given time to recover from journeys that had, for some of them, taken the better part of a year to complete. This slow, patient hospitality was not kindness. It was preparation. ensuring that when the moment finally came, the gathered Sith Lords would be relaxed, unguarded, and physically concentrated in exactly the locations the ritual required. The scale of what followed is difficult to convey even now. Contemporary accounts describe the sky itself changing color in the ritual's opening moments, a sickly, pulsing light visible from orbit, as the assembled dark side energy of thousands of practitioners was torn loose from their bodies in a single coordinated instant. Ships attempting to flee the surface once the true nature of the gathering became apparent found their engines failing, their crews collapsing at their stations, the same draining force that consumed the world below reaching upward to claim anyone still close enough to be caught in its radius. Survivors who managed to escape, and there were remarkably few of them, described a sensation unlike anything encountered in ordinary combat. Not pain, exactly, but a profound and horrifying sense of being unmade, of years and vitality being stripped away faster than the mind could process the loss. Those who watched from a safe distance, and there is reason to believe at least a handful of observers, did survive at the edges of the affected region, reported that the world's cities went dark within a matter of hours. Entire population centers extinguished simultaneously as though a switch had been thrown. The ordinary glow of civilization replaced by an absolute and unnatural stillness that outside observers described as somehow more disturbing than any explosion could have been. In the centuries that followed, the world at the center of this catastrophe became something close to a legend among those few who knew the true story. A place spoken of only in warnings, its coordinates deliberately omitted from official records, its name struck from navigational charts wherever those charts fell under the control of anyone aware of what had happened there. Expeditions that ventured near it in later eras, whether through ignorance or deliberate curiosity, reported instruments malfunctioning as they approached, a pervasive wrongness that defied easy explanation, and in the accounts of those with any sensitivity to the Force at all, an overwhelming, nauseating absence where the living currents of the Force should have been. It was not merely that the world had died. It was that the world had been unmade at a level the Force itself could not easily heal. A wound inflicted not by conventional violence, but by a ritual specifically designed to consume rather than merely destroy, and that distinction between destruction and consumption sat at the very heart of why this particular piece of forbidden knowledge was considered by later generations to be the single most dangerous doctrine the dark side had ever produced. When the ritual began, there was no warning and no mercy. The Sith Lord who had gathered them revealed his true purpose in an instant, unleashing a wave of dark side power that overwhelmed the minds of every single Sith Lord present simultaneously, stripping away their will and turning thousands of once proud practitioners into unwilling fuel for a single act of apotheosis. Their life force, and the life force of every living thing on the world beneath them, plant, animal, and microorganism alike, was drained away in a single catastrophic surge, funneled entirely into the being at the center of the ritual. When it was finished, an entire world lay silent, its every living cell extinguished, its very connection to the Force severed so completely that the world remains, to this day, an empty and lifeless scar, a wound in the galaxy that has never healed. And the Sith Lord who orchestrated it rose from the ashes of that sacrifice, transformed into something that could no longer accurately be described as mortal at all, a being who would go on to rule from the shadows for over 1,000 years. untouched by the slow decay that had claimed every other Sith Lord in history, carrying inside himself the stolen lifetimes of everyone he had annihilated to achieve it. In the immediate aftermath, the being who had orchestrated the ritual did not announce his transformation to the wider galaxy. He retreated instead into deep isolation, spending years in near total seclusion as his body and mind adjusted to a state of existence no living thing had ever previously occupied. Those few attendants permitted anywhere near him during this period described someone who seemed, for a time, almost lost inside his own newfound power, prone to long silences, to conversations that trailed off mid-sentence, as though some portion of his attention remained permanently fixed elsewhere. Perhaps on the thousands of consciousnesses he had absorbed in that single catastrophic instant, their fragments never fully digested, never fully silent, murmuring somewhere in the depths of a mind that was no longer entirely his alone. When he finally did emerge to resume an active role in galactic affairs, those who had known him before the ritual struggled to reconcile the person standing before them with the memory of who he had been. His presence had changed in ways difficult to describe precisely, a stillness to him that unsettled even seasoned dark side users, an unnerving sense that whatever inhabited that body was no longer entirely singular, no longer entirely bound by the same instincts and limitations that governed every other living being anyone in the room had ever encountered. This ritual stands, even among the darkest chapters of Sith history, as the clearest proof of why so much of this knowledge remained buried rather than shared. It was not hidden because it failed. It was hidden because it worked exactly as intended, because an entire world's worth of life had been proven capable of purchasing a single being's escape from death itself, and because no Sith Lord who ever learned the details of how it had been accomplished could be trusted not to attempt it again the moment they judged themselves powerful enough to gather the necessary sacrifice. Later generations who uncovered fragments of what had happened treated the ritual less as a technique to be studied than as a warning to be heeded, a demonstration of the exact point at which ambition stopped being a virtue and became something closer to annihilation, not just of enemies, but of the very foundation the Sith claimed to be building toward. And yet, as with so much forbidden knowledge before it, the fact that it was dangerous did not mean it was forgotten. It meant only that it went quiet, waiting in fragmentary records and half-burned texts for some future seeker convinced that they, unlike everyone who came before them, would know how to wield it safely. What we have covered so far are rituals of the body, transformations of flesh, metal, and mortality itself, the kind of forbidden knowledge that leaves physical evidence behind, a scarred world, a disfigured alchemist, a tomb full of the failed and the transformed. But there was a deeper layer still, a tradition of Sith knowledge that left no physical mark at all, that worked instead through illusion, domination, and curses woven so precisely into a bloodline or a location that their effects could linger for centuries after the sorcerer who cast them had turned to dust. That knowledge, quieter and in some ways more insidious than anything we have described so far, is where we turn next. Before we descend into it, though, it is worth sitting for a moment with the broader pattern that alchemy, the tomb trials, essence transfer, and the world ritual all share, because that pattern is really the through line connecting everything forbidden about Sith knowledge as a whole. Each of these disciplines began as a genuine attempt to solve a real problem, Alchemy promised control over a battlefield's most basic variables, the strength and loyalty of one's own forces. The tomb trials promised a reliable way to filter the capable from the incapable in a culture that could not afford to waste resources, training apprentices who would only be killed by their first serious rival. Essence transfer promised an answer to the one problem no army or empire could ever conquer, the simple fact of mortality. And the world ritual promised the ultimate solution to that same problem, permanence itself. Purchased in a single overwhelming act, rather than through a chain of increasingly risky transfers. Each discipline, in other words, began as a rational response to a real limitation. And each one, pursued far enough, revealed that the price of transcending a limitation was rarely paid by the person seeking to transcend it. It was paid by everyone and everything nearby. The failed creatures rotting in hidden chambers, the initiates lost in tombs, built to test them past the point of survival, the hosts whose minds were erased to make room for a borrowed second life. The entire world reduced to silence to grant one being permanence. This pattern repeats often enough across Sith history that later dark side scholars, in the rare surviving texts where such scholarship appears at all, began treating it almost as a law of nature specific to the dark side itself, an unavoidable exchange rate between power gained and cost externalized onto whoever happened to be weakest or nearest at the moment the ritual was performed. Whether that pattern reflects something intrinsic to the nature of the Force, some deep cosmic principle insisting that power drawn through domination must always be balanced by suffering inflicted elsewhere, or whether it simply reflects the psychology of beings who had already convinced themselves that ambition justified almost any cost, is a question none of the surviving texts ever fully resolve. What they do agree on, consistently, across centuries and across wildly different practitioners who never had any contact with one another, is that the pattern was real and that ignoring it tended to end badly for everyone who tried. Sorcery, in the way the Sith came to practice it, was never quite the same discipline as the more famous displays of dark side power. The galaxy came to fear the lightning, the choking grip, the raw telekinetic violence that ended so many confrontations in an instant. Sorcery worked slower, quieter, and in many ways, more permanently. Where a bolt of dark side lightning could kill a single enemy in a heartbeat, a well-constructed curse could unmake a bloodline across 10 generations, and where an illusion crafted through ordinary means might fool an eye for a moment, a sorcerous illusion woven with sufficient skill could convince an entire population that something false had always been true, embedding itself so deeply into memory and record that even those who had witnessed the original truth eventually came to doubt their own recollection. This was knowledge built for patience, for practitioners willing to accept results that might not fully manifest within their own lifetime, and it is precisely because of that patience that so much of it proved so difficult to contain once it was set loose. There is a reason this particular branch of dark side knowledge tends to be underrepresented in the more famous accounts of Sith history. The grand battles, the dramatic confrontations between master and apprentice, the fall of empires recorded in enough detail that later generations could reconstruct them centuries later. Sorcery rarely produced the kind of single dramatic moment that made for a compelling historical account. Its effects unfolded across years and decades, woven so gradually into the fabric of events that even careful observers living through the consequences often failed to recognize a sorcerer's hand behind what looked, from any reasonable vantage point, like an ordinary sequence of unfortunate circumstances. A war lost through a string of improbable tactical failures. A rival bloodline that simply produced weaker and weaker heirs across successive generations until it faded from relevance entirely. A fortress that stood empty and unclaimed for centuries despite an obviously strategic location. Avoided by settlers who could never quite articulate why the place unsettled them so deeply. Historians examining these events centuries later, working from records that rarely, if ever, mentioned sorcery explicitly, had every reason to conclude that ordinary explanations sufficed, and in most cases they likely did. But a meaningful minority of these seemingly ordinary historical patterns, according to the fragmentary sorcerous texts that do survive, were in fact the deliberate, patient handiwork of practitioners who understood that the most effective use of power was power nobody ever suspected had been used at all. The roots of Sith sorcery trace back to the same native traditions that shaped the earliest fusion between exiled Dark Jedi and the primitive sorcerers of the world they conquered. But where alchemy and the tomb trials evolved quickly into disciplines, the ruling class formalized and taught within their own hierarchy. Sorcery in its purest form tended to survive longest among smaller, more insular groups who never fully integrated into the broader Sith power structure. These groups guarded practices that predated the arrival of the exiles entirely, techniques passed down through maternal lines and closed covens rather than through the master and apprentice relationship that defined the wider Sith tradition. Outsiders, including many Sith lords who considered themselves masters of every dark side discipline worth knowing, often underestimated these smaller traditions, dismissing them as primitive superstition unworthy of serious study. This dismissal proved, time and again, to be a serious miscalculation because sorcery, unbound by the more rigid theoretical frameworks that governed mainstream Sith teaching, often achieved effects that formally trained practitioners struggled to replicate through any conventional method at all. Curses represented perhaps the most feared and most widely documented application of this tradition, and their power lay precisely in their patience. A curse cast with sufficient skill did not need to kill its target immediately, and in fact rarely did. Its purpose was to attach itself to a bloodline, to a location, to an object passed down through generations, and to wait, exerting a slow, corrosive influence that manifested differently depending on what it had been bound to. A cursed bloodline might find that ambition curdled into paranoia in every generation that carried it, that promising heirs died young with troubling regularity, that alliances formed by the family always seemed to collapse at the worst possible moment through some combination of bad luck too consistent to be entirely coincidental. A cursed location might simply refuse to prosper, crops failing without explanation, structures crumbling faster than their construction should have allowed, visitors reporting a persistent unease that drove them away long before they understood why they wanted to leave. A cursed object, perhaps the most insidious application of all, could travel far beyond the reach of whoever had originally cast the curse, passing from hand to hand across centuries, carrying its quiet influence into households and even entire organizations that had no idea they had inherited someone else's ancient grudge. What made curses so difficult to combat was the near-total absence of any reliable method for identifying one until its effects had already progressed far enough to cause serious damage. Ordinary misfortune and curse-driven misfortune looked, on the surface, identical. A string of bad luck, an inexplicable illness, a pattern of failure that any family or institution might experience, without supernatural interference at all. Only practitioners with genuine sorceress training could reliably distinguish the two. Sensing the particular texture a curse left behind in the force, a kind of directed intentionality that natural misfortune simply did not carry. This scarcity of qualified diagnosticians meant that most cursed bloodlines and cursed locations went entirely unidentified. Their suffering attributed to bad fortune, poor decisions, or simple coincidence for generations. The true cause never suspected because so few people alive possessed the sensitivity and training needed to recognize what they were actually looking at. Removing a curse, once identified, proved even more difficult than diagnosing one, because a well-constructed curse drew its staying power from having been woven deeply into the fabric of whatever it was bound to. Unraveling it required a practitioner who understood not just how to counter dark side energy in the moment, but how to trace and dissolve an intention that might have been laid down centuries earlier by someone whose original methods were no longer fully understood by anyone living. Attempts at removal that were rushed or incomplete often made the underlying problem worse rather than better, agitating a dormant curse into a more active and aggressive state, or severing only the visible symptoms while leaving the deeper binding fully intact to resume its work more subtly than before. The rare practitioners who did successfully break powerful curses tended to become minor legends in their own right, sought out across vast distances by desperate clients willing to pay almost any price, though the secretive nature of the broader sorceress tradition meant that even these successful practitioners rarely taught their full methodology to anyone outside a small circle of trusted successors, ensuring that this knowledge, like so much else we have discussed, remained perpetually scarce, even when demand for it was high. Among the rare curse breakers whose reputation survived long enough to reach the historical record, a recurring theme emerges in how they described their own methodology, to whatever limited extent any of them chose to describe it at all. Breaking a curse, according to these accounts, required first understanding the original intention behind it, not merely the mechanical structure of the dark side energy involved, but the specific emotional and psychological state of the caster at the moment the curse was formed. Since a curse cast from jealousy behaved differently and required a different approach to unravel than one cast from grief or from a desire for vengeance against a specific and named wrong. This meant that effective curse breaking was as much an exercise in a kind of historical and psychological reconstruction as it was a technical dark side skill, requiring the practitioner to essentially inhabit the emotional perspective of someone who might have died centuries earlier, understanding their original wound intimately enough to address it rather than simply attacking its symptoms. Practitioners who attempted removal without this deeper understanding, relying purely on raw dark side counterforce, tended to produce exactly the destabilizing failures described earlier, curses that went dormant only to resurface later in an even more aggressive and less predictable form. Having been wounded rather than truly resolved, illusion sorcery occupied a related but distinct branch of this same tradition, and its applications ranged from the tactically useful to the genuinely history-altering. At its simplest, illusion sorcery allowed a skilled practitioner to disguise their appearance, to make a small force appear larger than it was, to convince an approaching enemy that a fortified position stood empty, or that an empty position stood heavily defended. These battlefield applications, while valuable, represented only the surface of what the discipline was capable of in the hands of a truly gifted sorcerer. Deeper practice allowed illusions to be woven not just around physical appearance, but around memory itself, implanting false recollections in a target's mind with enough conviction that the target would defend those false memories as genuine, even under interrogation, even in some documented cases, under forms of dark side mind, probing that should, theoretically, have been capable of detecting the deception. The most feared sorcerers of this tradition were said to be capable of layering illusions across an entire population simultaneously, embedding a shared false memory into the collective consciousness of a settlement or a fleet, rewriting not just what individuals believed had happened, but what an entire community would insist, in unified and mutually reinforcing testimony, had actually occurred. This capability, once it became widely enough known to provoke genuine fear among other Sith Lords, was among the first sorcerous techniques to be actively suppressed rather than merely hoarded. The distinction matters. Most forbidden knowledge in Sith history was hidden because its possessor wanted to retain exclusive access to a valuable advantage. Memory-altering illusion sorcery was, in a number of documented instances, actively hunted and destroyed wherever it was found. Not because rival Sith Lords wanted to keep it for themselves, but because they recognized that a technique capable of rewriting collective memory posed a threat to every power structure equally, including their own. A ruler who commanded loyalty through fear and demonstrated strength had at least some confidence that his subjects' obedience reflected an accurate understanding of the consequences of disobedience. A ruler whose subjects' loyalty had been implanted through sorcerous illusion could never be certain that obedience reflected anything real at all, and could never be certain, more troublingly, that his own memories and judgments had not been subject to the same manipulation by some rival sorcerer operating in the shadows of his own court. This mutual vulnerability produced one of the rare instances in Sith history where competing power centers cooperated, however briefly and however distrustfully, to hunt down and eliminate a category of forbidden knowledge that threatened all of them equally. Holocrons occupy a strange middle position in this history. Simultaneously, the primary mechanism through which forbidden knowledge survived across centuries, and one of the most tightly restricted forms of dark side technology in their own right. At their simplest, holocrons were crystalline data storage devices capable of holding vast quantities of information, accessible to anyone with sufficient training and the correct method of activation. Sith holocrons, however, rarely functioned as simple archives. Many were imbued during their creation with a fragment of their creator's own consciousness, a kind of partial essence transfer applied not to a living body, but to a crystal matrix, producing a recorded intelligence capable of interacting with whoever accessed it, answering questions, offering guidance, and, in a great many documented cases, actively testing and manipulating the seeker before revealing anything of genuine value. This design choice, embedding a fragment of personality and judgment directly into the storage medium, meant that a Sith holocron was never a passive repository in the way an ordinary archive might be. It was an active gatekeeper, capable of assessing a seeker's worthiness, capable of lying, capable of demanding a price before releasing its contents, and in some of the more disturbing recorded encounters, capable of attempting to extend its own fragmentary existence by manipulating a seeker into performing rituals that would grant the holocron's embedded consciousness a fuller, more independent form of continued existence. Seekers who approached a Sith holocron carelessly, assuming it functioned like any conventional data source, frequently found themselves manipulated into far more dangerous bargains than they had anticipated, extracting a single piece of desired information only to discover, sometimes years later, that the holocron's embedded intelligence had planted a compulsion, a subtle directive, or in the most extreme cases, a fragment of its own consciousness somewhere within their mind during the exchange. Because of this inherent danger, the creation and distribution of holocrons became one of the most carefully controlled aspects of Sith knowledge transmission. A master creating a holocron to preserve their own teachings for a chosen successor took enormous care in designing its activation requirements, ensuring that only a seeker possessing very specific qualities, a particular bloodline, a particular level of demonstrated ruthlessness, a particular philosophical alignment with the creator's own worldview, could unlock its full contents. Holocrons that fell into the wrong hands, whether captured by rival Sith lords, recovered by Jedi hunters, or simply discovered by chance long after their creator's death, and the collapse of whatever context would have explained their proper use, became artifacts of enormous unpredictability, capable of corrupting or destroying anyone who attempted to access them without understanding the specific dangers embedded in their design. Entire vaults were constructed across the galaxy for the sole purpose of storing captured or recovered holocrons that were judged too dangerous to destroy outright, since the act of destruction itself sometimes released whatever consciousness or energy had been bound inside, but too dangerous to leave accessible to any future seeker who might stumble across them. The staffing of these vaults, in the rare accounts that describe them, tended to fall to individuals who occupied a peculiar and unenviable role within the broader Sith hierarchy, guardians trained specifically to resist the kind of manipulation a captured holocron might attempt against them. Individuals whose entire function was to catalog, monitor, and, when necessary, physically restrain artifacts that were, in a very real sense, still partially alive and still pursuing whatever goals their original creators had embedded in them centuries or millennia earlier. These guardians developed their own specialized body of forbidden knowledge over time, techniques for safely interrogating a hostile holocron without falling prey to its manipulations, methods for sensing when a supposedly dormant artifact had begun actively working toward escape or influence, despite every precaution taken to contain it. Some vaults, according to the more detailed surviving accounts, eventually accumulated enough dangerous artifacts in close proximity to one another that the Guardians reported a kind of ambient pressure building within the vault itself, competing consciousnesses seeming to sense one another's presence through the stone and metal, separating their individual containment, occasionally even communicating or conspiring across that separation in ways their original creators, isolated from one another by centuries, and often by mutual hostility while alive, could never have anticipated or intended. If sorcery and holocrons represent knowledge preserved through patience, the tradition of mass sacrifice ritual represents its opposite: power extracted in a single overwhelming burst, consumed rather than cultivated, spent all at once in pursuit of an effect too large to achieve through any more measured method. We have already described the single most catastrophic example of this tradition: an entire world drained to grant one being permanence beyond death. But that ritual, staggering as its scale was, represented only the most extreme endpoint of a much broader practice that recurred, in smaller and more contained forms, throughout Sith history. Whenever a practitioner judged that a goal was important enough to justify spending lives rather than years to achieve it. Smaller mass sacrifice rituals tended to follow a recognizable pattern regardless of the specific era or practitioner involved. A Sith Lord facing a crisis too large to resolve through conventional strength, an overwhelming enemy fleet, a rebellion spreading faster than loyal forces could contain it, a rival whose power had grown too significant to challenge through ordinary means would gather a group of followers, sometimes willing, sometimes not, and channel their combined life force into a single, overwhelming expenditure of dark side energy. The results varied, depending on the specific ritual employed and the skill of the practitioner directing it, but recorded outcomes included localized weather manipulation, severe enough to ground entire fleets, waves of psychic terror capable of breaking the morale of an approaching army before a single shot was fired. And in the most extreme documented cases, something close to a controlled detonation of raw force energy capable of leveling fortified positions that would have otherwise withstood months of conventional siege. The followers who provided the raw material for these rituals occupied a range of positions within Sith society, and the specific arrangement often revealed a great deal about the character of the practitioner conducting the ritual. Some Sith Lords drew exclusively from prisoners, slaves, or conquered populations who had no meaningful say in their own fate, treating the sacrifice as simply another form of extracted resource, no more morally significant than mining an ore deposit. Others, more troublingly, drew from their own followers, from apprentices and loyal soldiers who had pledged themselves to the Sith Lord's cause and who understood, at least in the abstract, that their master might one day call on that loyalty in ways that cost them everything. Recorded accounts of these more intimate sacrifices tend to carry a particular horror precisely because they involve genuine devotion being repaid with annihilation. Followers who believed themselves valued instruments of their master's will, discovering, in the ritual's final moments, that their entire purpose had always been to serve as fuel rather than as soldiers. A smaller number of these rituals, rarer and more feared than either of the two more common patterns, involved willing sacrifice among peers rather than subordinates. Groups of roughly equal Sith Lords choosing collectively to pool their combined strength into a single overwhelming effort, understanding fully that most or all of them would not survive the process. These voluntary collective rituals tended to be reserved for existential threats, significant enough that individual survival became a secondary consideration next to the survival of whatever cause or bloodline the group as a whole represented. And the rare surviving accounts of these events carry a strange, almost reverent tone, entirely absent from descriptions of rituals built on coerced or unwitting sacrifice, suggesting that even within a culture built on domination and betrayal, there remained space for a kind of grim solidarity when the stakes grew large enough. Regardless of the specific arrangement, mass sacrifice ritual carried a consistent and severe cost for the practitioner directing it, one that went beyond the obvious moral weight of the act itself. Channeling the combined life force of many beings through a single practitioner's body and will place enormous strain on that practitioner's own physiology, and accounts describe directors of these rituals aging visibly during the process, their hair turning white, their skin taking on a papery, desiccated quality, their bodies bearing the accumulated strain of energy never designed to pass through a single living conduit. Some practitioners who conducted particularly large rituals never fully recovered, living out shortened remaining lifespans marked by chronic pain and premature physical decline, their bodies having paid a portion of the same price extracted from their sacrificed followers, just distributed differently, spread across years of diminished health rather than concentrated into a single instant of extinguished life. This cost, visible and undeniable in a way that many other forms of forbidden knowledge manage to obscure, is likely part of why mass sacrifice ritual, despite its proven effectiveness, never became a routine tool even among Sith lords, otherwise willing to pay almost any price for power. The price here was simply too immediate, too visible, and too personally costly to the practitioner themselves to be deployed casually, reserved instead for moments when the alternative appeared to be certain and total defeat. The forging of a Sith apprentice represented a different category of forbidden practice entirely. One that operated not through metaphysical ritual, but through calculated, sustained psychological manipulation. And in some ways, it was the most quietly disturbing tradition of all, precisely because it required no exotic dark side technique to execute. Only patience, cruelty, and an intimate understanding of how to break down a mind and rebuild it according to a master's specifications. The mainstream Sith teaching of any given era acknowledged, at least in its formal philosophy, that strength required testing, that an apprentice coddled through their training would never develop the ruthlessness needed to survive in a culture built on betrayal. But the specific methods some masters developed to accomplish this testing went considerably further than mere difficult training, evolving into deliberate programs of induced trauma, designed to reshape an apprentice's fundamental psychology at a level closer to systematic psychological engineering than education. The most well-documented pattern involved the deliberate cultivation and subsequent destruction of an apprentice's attachments. A master might permit, or even actively encourage, an apprentice to form a close bond with a fellow student, a mentor figure outside the immediate training relationship, or in rarer and more extreme cases, a family member the apprentice had been allowed to maintain contact with despite their new life. Once that attachment had grown strong enough to matter, the master would engineer its destruction, sometimes through direct violence performed by the master's own hand, sometimes through manipulation designed to make the apprentice believe they themselves were responsible for whatever loss occurred. The stated purpose, according to surviving accounts of masters who defended the practice, was to force the apprentice to internalize a core tenet of Sith philosophy through lived experience rather than mere instruction. That attachment created vulnerability, that anything or anyone an apprentice cared about became, inevitably, a weapon a clever enemy could turn against them. An apprentice who survived this kind of engineered loss and emerged hardened rather than broken was considered to have passed a test no amount of physical training alone could replicate. The psychological cost of this approach, however, extended well beyond its intended lesson. Apprentices subjected to this kind of deliberate, repeated trauma frequently developed patterns of behavior that persisted long after their formal training ended. Difficulty forming any subsequent attachment without an underlying expectation of eventual betrayal. Hypervigilance that shaded into genuine paranoia, and in a significant number of documented cases, a compulsion to replicate the same cycle of cultivated and destroyed attachment on their own apprentices once they rose to the position of master themselves. This last pattern, the tendency for apprentices raised through this method to become masters who used the identical method on their own students, created something close to a self-perpetuating tradition, passed down not through any written text or formal instruction, but through the simple mechanism of trauma, reproducing itself across generations, each master inflicting on their students the same wound that had once been inflicted on them, convinced all the while that they were merely teaching the same hard, necessary lesson their own master had once taught them. Not every master who employed psychological forging techniques relied on destroyed attachment as their primary method. A related and equally documented tradition involved deliberately placing apprentices into prolonged competitive rivalry with one another, training multiple students simultaneously under conditions explicitly designed to pit them against each other, with the clear and often stated understanding that only the strongest would be permitted to survive to complete their training. This approach produced a different psychological profile than the destroyed attachment method. Apprentices who emerged not primarily fearful of forming bonds, but rather deeply, permanently oriented around zero-sum competition, unable to conceive of any relationship, professional or otherwise, that did not ultimately resolve into one party's dominance over the other. Masters who favored this method argued it produced more consistently capable Sith Lords than the attachment destruction approach, since it tested an apprentice's raw ability directly, rather than merely their capacity to endure suffering. Though critics within the broader Sith tradition, to whatever extent such critique was ever voiced openly, pointed out that a culture built entirely around zero-sum, internal competition struggled to produce the kind of coordinated, large-scale cooperation that had, on more than one occasion in Sith history, proven decisive against enemies who did not share the same self-destructive internal dynamics. Surviving accounts of specific rivalry cohorts trained under this method describe outcomes that varied enormously depending on the group size and the specific temperament of the master overseeing them. Smaller cohorts, 3 or 4 apprentices trained together under close and constant supervision, tended to produce more stable results, the competitive pressure remaining sharp enough to drive genuine improvement without escalating into the kind of open, mutually destructive sabotage that larger and more loosely supervised groups frequently descended into. Larger cohorts, by contrast, sometimes numbering a dozen or more apprentices trained simultaneously under a single master's nominal authority, produced considerably higher attrition rates, with apprentices forming and breaking shifting alliances against one another long before any formal test of their abilities was ever conducted. The training environment itself becoming a kind of accelerated preview of the political betrayals that would define their later careers as full Sith Lords. Masters who favored these larger cohorts argued that this early exposure to shifting political alliance and betrayal was itself the most valuable lesson the training could offer, considerably more useful in the long run than any specific combat technique or dark side skill, since an apprentice who had already learned to navigate constantly shifting loyalties among their own peers entered their adult career with an instinctive fluency in exactly the kind of treacherous social terrain that claimed the lives of so many less prepared Sith Lords in their first years of independent power. A third and considerably rarer forging tradition, documented in only a handful of surviving accounts but notable for how starkly it differed from the 2 more common methods, involved masters who chose deliberate isolation rather than either destroyed attachment or engineered rivalry as their primary tool. Removing a chosen apprentice from all contact with other living beings for extended periods, sometimes months, in the most extreme recorded cases, years, leaving them alone with nothing but their own thoughts, their training exercises, and whatever dark side entities might make contact with a mind pushed to the edge of isolation-induced instability. Masters who favored this method argued that attachment and rivalry both ultimately depended on other people, and that a truly self-sufficient Sith Lord needed to develop their strength from a foundation that did not depend on anyone else's presence or absence at all, neither the presence of someone to lose nor the presence of a rival to defeat. Apprentices who survived this isolation method intact, and survival was by no means guaranteed, given how many recorded cases ended in the same kind of ritual-induced madness we will discuss shortly, tended to emerge with a particular quality other Sith Lords found difficult to categorize, an interior stillness that some observers read as genuine strength and others read as something closer to a fundamental disconnection from any of the drives. Ambition, fear, desire for status that motivated more conventionally forged practitioners. Whether this isolation method produced superior Sith Lords or simply a smaller number of survivors who happened to be unusually resilient to begin with remains, like so much else in this tradition, a question the surviving fragmentary evidence cannot fully resolve. Beyond the formal structure of master and apprentice that most outside observers associate with Sith tradition, a quieter category of dark side practice persisted across the galaxy in the form of hereditary covenants. Family bloodlines bound to specific dark side traditions, not through formal training but through inheritance, ritual, and in some documented cases, something closer to a literal supernatural contract, passed down from one generation to the next. These bloodline covenants existed largely outside the visibility of the mainstream Sith power structure, surviving in isolated pockets, remote worlds, and closed communities that had little interest in participating in the larger conflicts between rival Sith Lords, and even less interest in drawing the kind of attention that participation would inevitably invite. The clearest documented examples of this tradition come from matrilineal magic practicing communities that maintained control over specific dark side techniques for countless generations, techniques focused less on the kind of raw, destructive power favored by mainstream Sith Lords and more on domination, manipulation, and the binding of will, both over other beings and, in the most advanced practitioners, over the fundamental building blocks of life itself. These communities operated under a fundamentally different social structure than the master and apprentice hierarchy that defined broader Sith culture, organized instead around a matriarchal council structure where knowledge was transmitted through direct maternal lineage, mothers to daughters, with sons in many of these traditions occupying a subordinate role, valued as soldiers and laborers, but rarely entrusted with the deeper sorcerous knowledge that defined the community's true power. What made these bloodline traditions particularly resistant to outside disruption was the specific mechanism through which their knowledge was preserved. Rather than relying on written texts, holocrons, or formal instruction that could be captured, destroyed, or corrupted by an outside conqueror, many of these communities embedded core knowledge directly into ritual practices performed at specific life stages, coming-of-age ceremonies, bonding rituals, funeral rites, each one designed to transmit not just information, but a kind of lived, embodied understanding that could not easily be extracted through interrogation or captured through the theft of physical records. A conqueror who overran one of these communities and captured its written records, to whatever extent such records even existed, often found that they had captured only the barest outline of what the community actually knew, the deeper knowledge remaining locked inside the minds and practiced instincts of surviving members who could not simply hand it over even under threat of death, since the knowledge itself was inseparable from years of embodied ritual practice that could not be transmitted through mere explanation. This resilience made bloodline covenant tradition simultaneously one of the most stable repositories of forbidden knowledge in galactic history, and one of the most difficult for outside scholars, whether Jedi, Sith, or independent researchers, to ever fully document or understand. Mainstream Sith Lords who encountered these communities faced a genuine dilemma. Conquering and absorbing them promised access to genuinely unique and powerful techniques, unavailable anywhere else in the galaxy. But the resistant, embedded nature of the knowledge meant that conquest rarely produced the clean transfer of power a Sith Lord might expect from defeating a rival and seizing their holocrons and written texts. More than one ambitious conqueror attempted to force a bloodline community to simply teach their techniques under threat of annihilation, only to discover that the community's knowledge holders would choose death individually and repeatedly over transmission to an unworthy or hostile outsider, a form of resistance that proved remarkably difficult to overcome through conventional intimidation. The relationship between these bloodline traditions and the broader Sith Order therefore tended, across most of recorded history, toward an uneasy distance rather than either full integration or open conflict. Sith Lords who recognized the value of what these communities protected often chose negotiation and alliance over conquest, offering protection, resources, or political advantage in exchange for limited cooperation, a handful of trained practitioners loaned out for a specific campaign. A single technique shared under careful restriction, rather than attempting the costly and uncertain project of full subjugation. These alliances, when they held, tended to benefit both parties considerably, but they also remained perpetually fragile, built on a foundation of mutual wariness that could collapse into betrayal whenever either side judged that the balance of advantage had shifted sufficiently in their favor. One particularly well-documented alliance of this kind endured, according to the fragmentary records that describe it, across several successive generations of both the ruling Sith bloodline and the Covenant community it had negotiated with. A relationship maintained through periodic renewal ceremonies where each side reaffirmed the original terms of their arrangement in the presence of witnesses from both traditions. What made this particular alliance notable and worth preserving in whatever records survive of it was how explicitly both sides acknowledged the fundamentally transactional and mutually suspicious nature of their cooperation. Neither side pretending to trust the other's deeper motives, both sides maintaining independent contingency plans in case the arrangement ever broke down into open hostility. This clear-eyed, unsentimental approach to alliance may explain why the relationship lasted as long as it did, in contrast to other documented attempts at similar cooperation that collapsed far more quickly, having been built on a foundation of one side's genuine belief in the other's goodwill. A belief that proved, with grim predictability, to be misplaced the moment circumstances shifted enough to make betrayal profitable. Not every attempt to draw dark side power from beyond the mainstream Sith tradition ended in even this uneasy accommodation. The historical record includes numerous accounts of rituals that went catastrophically wrong, either because the practitioner attempting them lacked sufficient skill to control what they were invoking, because the ritual itself contained an inherent instability that no level of skill could fully overcome, or because the underlying dark side power being channeled simply proved larger and less controllable than its invoker had anticipated. These failures deserve particular attention precisely because they represent the clearest evidence for why so much of this knowledge remained forbidden, even within a culture that otherwise celebrated the pursuit of power at almost any blank's cost. Possession accounts constitute the most frequently documented category of ritual failure across Sith history, and the pattern they describe is remarkably consistent. A practitioner attempting to channel, bind, or communicate with some external dark side entity, whether a captured spirit, an ancient tomb intelligence, or in the rarer and more extreme cases, something considerably older and less well understood, would misjudge the balance of power in the exchange, intending to use the entity as a tool only to discover that the entity had, over the course of the ritual, reversed the intended relationship entirely. Victims of successful possession in these accounts did not typically experience an obvious, dramatic transformation visible to outside observers in the ritual's immediate aftermath. The process tended to be gradual, the possessing influence exerting itself through subtle shifts in judgment, in temperament, in the kinds of decisions the possessed practitioner began making, until associates who had known them before the ritual found themselves unable to pinpoint exactly when their colleague, friend, or master had stopped being entirely themselves. The most disturbing accounts of failed ritual describe cases where the practitioner's own community failed to recognize the possession until it had already caused significant damage. A Sith Lord's uncharacteristic decisions attributed to shifting strategy rather than external influence, escalating cruelty, explained away as simple hardening rather than as evidence that something else now sat behind familiar eyes. By the time possession was recognized for what it was, if it ever was recognized at all before the possessed individual's death or disappearance, the damage inflicted in the interim, purges of loyal followers who had grown suspicious, alliances shattered by decisions that made no strategic sense, resources squandered pursuing goals that served the possessing entity's interests rather than the original practitioner's own, had frequently already proven irreversible. Some accounts describe successful exorcism, achieved through the intervention of a sufficiently powerful outside practitioner willing to risk the attempt, but a considerably larger number of documented cases end simply with the possessed individual's eventual death, sometimes by their own hand in a final moment of clarity, sometimes at the hands of followers or rivals, who concluded that whatever now occupied their former ally's body needed to be destroyed, regardless of what remained of the original person inside it. One especially detailed account, preserved because it was recorded by a rival faction with every motive to document the incident thoroughly for their own strategic purposes, describes a regional Sith commander who attempted to bind and question the lingering spirit of a defeated predecessor entombed on a world under the commander's control. Seeking military intelligence, the predecessor was believed to have taken to the grave. The ritual, by the account's description, appeared to succeed exactly as intended, the commander reporting valuable strategic information in the days immediately following the attempt, information that proved accurate and useful enough to secure several subsequent victories. It was only months later that associates began noting small but persistent changes. A shift in the commander's preferred tactics away from patterns that had defined their entire career. A growing and uncharacteristic obsession with reclaiming territory the predecessor had specifically lost centuries earlier, decisions that made increasingly little sense from the commander's own strategic position, but perfect sense as a continuation of a dead rival's unfinished ambitions. By the time the commander's own advisors grew suspicious enough to act, the personality directing their forces bore almost no resemblance to the individual who had originally attempted the binding ritual, and the eventual resolution, according to the account, required an assassination carried out by the commander's own most trusted lieutenant, who reported afterward that the eyes of the body he had killed held an expression of what he described only as relief. Madness represented a related but distinct category of ritual failure, one that did not involve any external entity taking control, but rather the practitioner's own mind, simply proving unable to withstand the strain of whatever dark side power they had attempted to channel. Unlike possession, which tended to manifest through gradual, deniable shifts in behavior, ritual-induced madness often announced itself far more dramatically. Sudden breaks from coherent thought and speech, violent episodes with no discernible strategic purpose, an apparent loss of the capacity to distinguish between the ritual's imagined or perceived effects and physical reality. Practitioners who survived episodes like this, when they survived at all, rarely returned to their previous level of function, and Sith society, for all its emphasis on ruthless pragmatism, generally treated these broken practitioners with a kind of wary distance rather than outright execution, a mixture of residual fear at what they might still be capable of in an unpredictable episode and a lingering respect for the power they had once wielded before their mind gave way under its weight. A number of accounts describe broken practitioners being relocated to remote holdings, technically still in service, technically still afforded the deference their former rank demanded, but functionally isolated from any position where their unpredictability could cause serious damage. These arrangements rarely lasted comfortably. A mind fractured by dark side overreach did not simply settle into quiet retirement, and caretakers assigned to these isolated holdings frequently reported escalating incidents over time, rather than a gradual stabilization, outbursts that grew more frequent rather than less, as whatever damage had been done continued to compound rather than heal. Some of these broken practitioners retained, even amid apparent incoherence, flashes of their original capability, moments where a lifetime of training reasserted itself with terrifying precision before dissolving again into whatever fractured state had become their permanent condition. And these moments proved particularly dangerous for anyone assigned to manage them, since they created a persistent and justified uncertainty about whether a given interaction would encounter the broken remnant or the still lethal practitioner underneath. The relationship between madness and possession, worth noting before moving on, was not always as clearly distinguishable in practice as describing them as separate categories might suggest. Some of the most disturbing accounts describe cases that appeared to begin as one and transform into the other. A practitioner whose mind first fractured under the strain of a ritual gone wrong, leaving behind exactly the kind of destabilized, vulnerable psychological state that made subsequent possession by an opportunistic external influence considerably easier to achieve. Whether the entities responsible for these secondary possessions actively sought out minds already weakened by prior ritual trauma, or whether such minds simply presented an easier target that any sufficiently patient dark side intelligence would eventually exploit given enough time, remains an open question in the surviving scholarship, one that speaks to how poorly understood the deeper mechanics of this entire category of forbidden knowledge remained even among those who spent their lives studying it. perhaps the most sobering category of failure, though involved rituals that succeeded exactly as designed and still proved catastrophic, cases where the practitioner achieved precisely the power or transformation they had sought, only to discover that the achievement itself carried consequences they had failed to anticipate or had chosen to dismiss in their pursuit of the ritual's promised reward. A practitioner who successfully extended their own lifespan through essence transfer, only to find that centuries of accumulated existence gradually eroded whatever remained of their original motivations and values, leaving them powerful but hollow, pursuing goals that no longer connected to any coherent purpose, beyond the bare continuation of their own existence. A bloodline successfully cursed to ensure a rival's downfall, only for the caster to discover, generations later, that the same curse had metastasized beyond its original target and begun consuming allies and descendants the caster had never intended to harm. These accounts carry a particular weight precisely because they cannot be dismissed as failures of skill or preparation. The ritual worked. The power was real, and the cost, delayed and indirect as it often was, proved in the end no less devastating than the more immediate and obvious failures that filled the rest of this dark and buried history. What, in the end, are we meant to take from all of this? Not a manual, certainly fragmentary as these accounts are, stripped by centuries of secrecy and deliberate destruction of exactly the details that would make any of it genuinely replicable, even by someone determined to try. What remains instead is something closer to a pattern, repeated across thousands of years and dozens of distinct traditions, each one promising a shortcut around some fundamental limitation, mortality, weakness, loss, uncertainty, and each one, without a single documented exception, across the full sweep of this history, extracting a price from someone that the practitioner seeking power had not fully anticipated or had chosen, in the heat of ambition, not to look at too closely. The Sith who buried this knowledge were not, for the most part, motivated by remorse in any sense a more conventional morality would recognize. They buried it because they had seen firsthand exactly how the exchange worked, and because even a philosophy built entirely around the pursuit of strength eventually has to reckon with the difference between strength that lasts and strength that simply borrows against a future it never intends to repay. That reckoning, quiet, uncomfortable, and buried as deeply as everything else described here, may be the single most forbidden piece of knowledge in this entire dark tradition, more dangerous in its own way than any ritual, because it is the one truth capable of making even a Sith Lord question whether the power they had spent a lifetime chasing was ever really worth what it cost to obtain. It is worth remembering, as we close this account, how much of what we have covered survives only in fragments, precisely because the beings who practiced it wanted it that way. Every tomb sealed, every holocron hidden behind a vault door, every bloodline covenant that chose death over disclosure represents a deliberate act of erasure performed by people who understood their own knowledge well enough to fear its uncontrolled spread more than they feared its loss. That is, in its own quiet way, a kind of warning far more credible than any outside condemnation could ever be. Critics of the dark side, whether Jedi, historians, or simple observers looking back from a safer distance, have never been in short supply, and their warnings, however accurate, always carry the possibility of bias, of an outside perspective that never truly understood what it was condemning. The Sith, who buried their own forbidden knowledge, carried no such outside bias. They understood exactly what they had built, exactly what it cost, and exactly who ended up paying that cost. And having understood all of that as clearly as anyone possibly could, they chose burial over propagation regardless. Perhaps that is the most fitting note to end on. Not a moral pronouncement about power and its costs. Since morality was never a currency this particular tradition dealt in with any consistency, but simply an observation about pattern, repeated with remarkable consistency across thousands of years, dozens of distinct practitioners, and traditions that in many cases had no contact with one another at all. Power extracted through domination, whether of another body, another mind, another bloodline, or an entire world, tended to demand a price disproportionate to whatever it purchased, a price paid not always by the practitioner directly, but inevitably by someone, somewhere, close enough to the ritual's reach to be caught within it. The knowledge of how to extract that power survives, in fragments, in ruins, in the occasional recovered holocron still waiting in some forgotten vault, for a seeker determined enough to risk what it might cost them, whether that knowledge should stay buried or whether some future seeker might yet find a way to draw on it without paying the same terrible price every predecessor before them was forced to pay, is a question this account cannot answer. It can only tell you, as clearly as the fragmentary record allows, exactly what happened to everyone who tried before.